after the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, demolished the Eastern Roman army at the Battle of Manzikert. All of Eastern Christendom was in threat of collapsing. To make matters worse, not even a year later, the greatest of these Christian kings in the East, Bagrat IV of Georgia, died. The crown and heavy responsibility of keeping the Seljuk Turks at bay would be passed on to his son, the now King George II. His troubled reign would be clouded as one of the darkest chapters in all of Georgian history. If you don't want to be betrayed online, then I suggest you look to today's sponsor, Aura. Have you ever Googled yourself before and didn't like what you found? It's unsettling, isn't it? Seeing your personal information just out there, for sale to the highest bidder. I mean, after looking up my name, I found 4 data broker sites selling my information. One even had my previous home address, and when I searched my email, it got worse. I counted 12 sites, but I'm sure there's more. It's like, hey, that's my private information. Who gave you the right to sell it? And you know what's even crazier? These data brokers, they're selling our information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who wants to target us. It's a real violation of our privacy. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information, automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my digital footprint not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it also protects me from hackers who could use this information to access my accounts or steal my identity. And let's be real, it's not just data brokers we have to worry about. Sometimes it's companies we're supposed to trust. Like how AT&T recently revealed that over 73 million customer records were released on the dark web. They recommended using strong passwords, monitoring account activity, and considering credit freezes or fraud alerts. But who has the time for all of that? Well, Aura does it all for me. And the best part? I don't have to download a bunch of different apps just because a company couldn't keep my data secure. Aura is always on, always working to keep me and my family safe. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to Aura.com and try your first 2 weeks for free. The link is also in the description below. George II Bagrationi would inherit Georgia at the age of 22, making him the first in his line to not be a boy king upon his coronation. But this is not wholly accurate. Nearly 22 years ago, as a newborn infant, George II was first crowned as the King of Georgia. This was a ploy made by a disloyal duke named Liptaret, who in 1050 had expelled Bagrat IV all the way to Constantinople. With Bagrat gone, George served as a much more suitable puppet. After 3 years of this, the true King Bagrat returned to Georgia and settled the score with his more than persistent nobility. In 1053, a 3-year-old King George II was relieved of the crown and returned to his role as prince and heir. With his first and brief kingship at an end, let's go back to his second and even more troubled. Upon his ascension, a much older King George II ran into the exact same problem that his father and grandfather had to contend with as boy kings. Powerful and unbending nobles seeking to take advantage of the Bagrationi crown. They were unsurprisingly led by the son of Duke Liptaret himself, Ivan. With this multi-generational rivalry not coming to an end anytime soon, King George had a different strategy to pacify his countrymen. He was going to give them exactly what they wanted. As his grandfather, the first King George of Georgia, might do, he simply chose to please the nobles, granting them land concessions and restoring the lands of Liptaret's son. For now. The aristocracy was settled just in time, considering the return of the Seljuks only a few months later. In 1073, Alp Arslan would die shortly after his shining moment at Manzikert. His son and successor, Sultan Malik Shah, wanted to start his reign the same way Alp Arslan began his, by invading the Caucasus and subjugating Georgia. With help from a Kurdish emir of Aran named Sarang, Malik Shah captured parts of southeast Georgia. Coincidentally, some of the same lands King George had just given Duke Ivan Liptaret. Malik Shah then granted these occupied lands to the Kurdish emir, hoping that he would become his growing vassal in the Caucasus. As for Duke Ivan, he became the next member of his family to formally betray the King of Georgia. Unlike his father, he did not side with the Byzantines. Ivan had already burnt that bridge long ago. Instead, he gave his loyalty and his son to Malik Shah. Before leaving the Northern Front, Malik Shah instructed Emir Sarang to complete the conquest of Georgia on his behalf, granting him an army and all the resources of the Seljuks' vassal swarm in the Caucasus to do so. Just outside of Duke Ivan's ancestral lands, the King of Georgia, along with his ally, King Agsartan of Kakheti Hereti, met the Emir of Aran on the battlefield for the second time in 10 years. Even with the Kartvelians united, they could only muster 25,000 men at the most, while the Seljuk and their subjects had more than double that number. In the field just outside of Partskizi Castle, the two coalitions met at full force. The details of the battle have been lost to time, but it was no short affair, apparently lasting for the majority of a day before the Georgians somehow managed to claw their way to victory. As the new rulers of both Georgia and the Seljuks tested each other, it would ultimately be King George who would come out on top. After this battle, the Georgian resurgence began as they retook southeast Georgia from the clutches of Emir Sarang. On the opposite side of the kingdom, the Byzantines sat, perhaps even more nervous than the Kartvelians. After Manzikert, the Eastern Romans began a massive withdrawal from their oriental provinces. Instead of completely abandoning them, the Byzantines gave this land to someone who had proven that they could beat the Seljuks. The only other adjoining Christian king in the east, George II. If Georgia was a rival before, then they were Byzantium's best friend now. They restored all Georgian possessions to their borders before the Byzantine-Georgian Wars, including Tau, and even the seaside enclave of Anacopia. Not only this, but the Byzantine emperor who was married to King George's sister, Maria, granted George II with the most illustrious of Roman titles. While the rulers of Georgia and even ancient Iberia held the titles of Coripalates, Nobilissimus, and Sebastos, now King George II would be referred to as the Caesar of the East. While the title of Caesar was overused and underappreciated at this point, it's the principle of this that matters. It really shows how fast the tunes of foreign policy can change when the Romans perceive a larger threat. But was George II the right Caesar for the job? Could he hold back the Turks? Well, for a while, he did. While the return of a huge tract of land did make the Kingdom of Georgia that much more powerful, it also put them more directly into the crossfire of Sultan Malik Shah. It was Georgia alone who stood defiant against the Turks. To crush them would mean hegemony over the Caucasus and the Christian East. In 1076, the Great Turkish Invasion of Georgia truly began. If all before was only a prelude, then I'm sure you can imagine the outcome of this so aptly named conflict. Malik Shah personally led a grand host into the Caucasus. King George was forced onto the defensive and fell back towards the safety of the relatively untouched West. After continuing through Georgia, fires and ashes behind them, the Turkish army left the ruined fields. But some of these Turks stayed and settled in this newly conquered and fertile land. Year after year, Seljuk hordes poured into Georgia. King George being left helpless in the face of insurmountable odds. In 1080, the main Georgian army, led by their king, was soundly defeated by a Seljuk general. He promptly retreated all the way to the safety of Abkhazia. Although Abkhazia would surely hold, as it always had, the rest of Georgia was fully razed. The kingdom was now completely overrun. In the following year of 1081, King George did the only thing left to do. He started the long journey to Esfahan to personally submit himself and his country to Sultan Malik Shah. Upon arriving, he was forced into vassalization and made to pay a yearly tribute to keep the Seljuks at bay. While Malik Shah would never raid Georgia again, the rest of the Seljuk hordes heeded no agreement. What followed would be one of the darkest moments in Georgian history. The invasions continued in perpetuity. The Seljuks no longer came in the thousands, but tens of thousands of Turks began settling in Georgia. Farmlands and vineyards were destroyed and replaced by grazing lands for horses and sheep. The Georgian capital of Kutaisi and the stronghold fort of Artunaji were both burnt to the ground. Georgia was being torn apart, inside out. King George was paralyzed, only hoping to preserve some sense of the Georgian state remaining in Abkhazia. No matter how much the Seljuks raided, they still had a diplomatic touch to their style of devastation. To have one weak king ruling over the Kartvelians would mean Georgia and Kakheti Hareti would all be much easier targets together. A Seljuk host alongside a more than bitter Georgian army marched together on a man George had fought alongside not long ago, King Ag Sartan of Kakheti Hareti. After a great push into the Central Caucasus, the joint invasion was grinded down to a halt at the fortress of Vezhny. After half a year, Kakheti Hareti withstood the attack and forced King George and the Seljuks back. While there was only room for one Kartvelian king, the Caucasus was big enough to host a Kartvelian sultan as well. After the siege of Vezhny was lifted, King Ag Sartan converted to Islam and allied himself to the Seljuks. He died shortly after this, but his son, Kivrike IV, retained the religion of Islam and the Turkish alliance. For nearly a decade, the Turkish raids of Georgia continued and only grew in number. If something did not change soon, Sakartvelo would be lost for good. The straw that finally broke the back of Georgia occurred in 1088. A massive 6.5 magnitude earthquake rocked southern Georgia. Occurring on the day of Jesus' resurrection, as the churches collapsed, it was almost as if God himself was displeased with King George II. With dark times only getting darker, the Georgian nobility did what they did best. Led by the archbishop and tutor of the prince, the nobles overthrew their ruler and forced King George II to abdicate his throne in favor of his 16-year-old son. George was not killed or imprisoned, but only forced to place the crown of Georgia directly onto the head of their greatest king and first emperor, David the Rebuilder. After his retirement, George II remained by his son and stayed on as the most loyal of the young king's advisors. He died in 1112 at the age of 62, having seen Georgia be destroyed under his rule and restored under that of his sons. King George II is an example of an average king stuck in very dark times. While he did preserve Georgia long enough to hand it over to his son, the damage had already been done. The Seljuks firmly settled in the gates, the crops burned, the churches fell, and the great Turkish invasion would leave tens of thousands dead in its wake. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savak Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Voician, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, and Dalinar. Or become a YouTube channel member, like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, What? Why? And Nickmate Voician again. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, I really appreciate it.